I want to welcome you here, and before I say who I am, I have a more important thing to say, which I don't want to forget, which is please turn off your cell phone, your BlackBerry. Now I just realized mine's on, if I can find it, because it really does interfere. And also, if I don't tell you and you don't turn them off, and then we hear the interference, I will get in trouble from the people who told me to tell you to turn them off. My name is George Perkovich. I'm the Vice President for Studies here at the Endowment and Director of the Nuclear Policy Program. And it's my mixed pleasure to welcome you all here for this event. The pleasure is mixed, obviously, because the subject of the meeting and its timing as an anniversary are deeply regrettable. People of Japan are still in the process of persevering and dealing with the tragedy and the disaster that occurred there. I was in Japan several times last year, but in Hiroshima in August, and struck again by the resilience and the determination of people there, and that remains on display, and it will be an ongoing challenge for some time to come. And so while we are doing our job, in a sense, as analysts, as a think tank, and you all as professionals in this field, to be examining what happened, what are the implications, what can be learned, what can be done better going forward, it is fundamentally a human tragedy, and there's a great deal of pain and suffering that has gone on. And so I just don't want to lose sight of that as we get in and start grinding on the details and thinking about how to learn from this tragedy. We have you have a schedule in front of you. We have 3 panels. We have a group of truly outstanding speakers that I'm not going to introduce now, or at least not all of them, but I think you will agree beforehand and will agree after that it truly is a distinguished group. I'm going to moderate and introduce the first panel, however, which is focusing on the question, was the Fukushima accident preventable? James Acton and Mark Hibbs have just produced, and I think it's outside available, a paper that addresses precisely this question. James is a senior associate here at Carnegie. He's a physicist from Cambridge University. He has spent much of the last year digging into and analyzing what happened in Fukushima, and I think with great aplomb has helped in the commentary in the United States from the beginning of the disaster onward. This doesn't often happen, but I will tell a little story. We had our big international conference last April, and I was to introduce Senator John Kyle, and who was standing in the wing, and so we were talking, and I have to tell you, I'm not a big fan of Senator Kyle, and I'm sure he's not a big fan of me, or if he paid any attention to what I write, he wouldn't be. But anyway, he said, wait, Carnegie, he says, you guys have that young guy who's been talking. I've been seeing him every morning on the Fukushima. So I said, oh, James Acton. He says, yes, he said, he is really fair and balanced, which Fox News logo. And I said, and he says, and I'm so disappointed because Fox News' coverage has been so slanted. And I looked at him and I laughed. And I said, well, James is fair and balanced, but I'm shocked that you're surprised that Fox isn't. But anyway, but James is fair and balanced, and so we're delighted to have him. And then Mark Hibbs, who is, kind of a legendary reporter in the field of especially nuclear industry, been for several decades now, was at Nucleonics Week. We're just proud and delighted to have him at Carnegie, but he's a tremendous analyst and reporter on all things nuclear, and you'll see that here. And so I'm going to turn it over to them. But before I do that, this is actually comical, but you don't know it. If anybody's tweeting, and I don't know how you tweet, but if anybody is tweeting, we have a handle, a Twitter handle, which is at Carnegie NPP. So you could tweet, but how do they tweet if they're supposed to have their things off?
They're supposed to be off, right?
Okay, so I think you have to turn the thing on to tweet, but in that case, go outside during a break or something and tweet, or at lunch. And then when you do that, it's at Carnegie NPP, and then somebody will tell me that you guys tweeted. So with that background, let me turn it over to James.
Thanks, George. There's been two major nuclear accidents with large off-site releases of radiation in the history of civilian nuclear energy. That's, of course, Chernobyl and Fukushima. If you think about how frequently that has occurred relative to the rate of reactor operation, you discover there's about one major accident every 17,500 years of reactor operation to date. That's considerably more, a factor of about 20 more frequent than the IAEA's advisory board thinks ought to occur. So this raises the question about how much safer can nuclear power be made. And one way of answering this question, one way of getting a handle on this question, is to ask whether past accidents were preventable. Can we be confident of preventing a recurrence of past accidents? In the case of the first two accidents, major accidents, one of which led to a large amount of off-site release of radiation, that's 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, I think there's good reasons to suppose that the improved safety measures, particularly related to operator training but also reactor design, would prevent a recurrence of those accidents. Superficially, Fukushima appears to be different. The plant was hit by an earthquake and then a massive tsunami. I'll discuss in a second some of the damage that was done. But superficially, it appears that Fukushima was hit by this unpredictable act of God, and in some sense, the accident was not preventable. Mark and I, the thesis we outline in the paper is that was wrong, in the following sense. Had Japan followed international standards and international best practice, our argument, the evidence suggests that this accident would not have happened. Both because there would have been a significant chance that Japan could have predicted the possibility of the plant being hit by a massive earthquake and tsunami, but also because even if it had failed to do so, design measures for plants that are standard in many countries around the world, we believe would have prevented the tsunami from triggering the accident. And that's a thesis that we're outlining today. I'm not going to recap the accident in a huge amount of depth, just pull out certain key points from it. So apologies if this ends up being slightly simplistic. The earthquake, and in particular the tsunami that hit the plant on March the 11th, 2011, actually destroyed a series of critical safety systems in the plant. Firstly, it destroyed all of the capacity, all of the both internal and external sources of AC power, alternating current. The DC power in units 1 and 3 were also destroyed. And that feature, this loss of energy, this loss of power, this station blackout, has been widely noted. But there were two other also significant areas of damage to the plant. First, the seawater pumps were destroyed. And those pumps are what's known in jargon as the ultimate heat sink. It's the way of transferring heat that's produced in the reactor core into the environment, in this case, the ocean. And in addition to that, the electrical distribution system of the plant was also very heavily damaged. Let me highlight 3 points that are salient to our subsequent argument about the accident. First, the accident progressed very quickly. In particular, in Unit 1, there was damage to the fuel assemblies based on the best modeling we've seen 3 to 4 hours after the earthquake. So that's about 2 to 3 hours after the tsunami. The fuel in Unit 1 started to melt. Secondly, the operators confronting the accident were operating under truly appalling and stressful conditions. I think the IAEA report details this very well. You know, the plant was covered in mud. There were manhole covers were missing, so there was a real danger of falling. A huge amount of equipment had been destroyed. Debris was scattered everywhere. And, you know, you also have to recognize that the plant operators, in many cases, probably wouldn't have known whether their families were alive or dead at that point. And thirdly, the preparation for accident management was insufficient. Given these points, we think it's it's somewhat unfair to direct significant criticism against the operators of the plant. And we highlight that because one of the official reports, the one appointed by the executive branch of the Japanese government, it appears to be moving in the direction of laying significant blame at the feet of the operators. We think if you take together the lack of time, the stress, and the lack of proper preparation, that such criticism is unfair. And rather, what we identify as the root causes of this accident are firstly problems associated with hazard assessment that I'm going to discuss, and secondly, issues associated with design that Mark's going to discuss. And Mark will also discuss briefly some of the underlying causes of the accident. We actually don't know exactly how big the tsunami that hit the plant on March the 11th was, because the seawater gauge next to the plant was destroyed. Computer modeling suggests, based on the observed pattern of flooding, suggests that the tsunami was 13.1 meters high. Once it ran up the slope, it went even higher. But at that moment before it hit the plant, the evidence seems to suggest it was about 13.1 meters high. By contrast, the legal design basis, the height of the tsunami that, according to the licensing documents the plant could withstand, was 3.1 meters. Now, TEPCO had voluntarily extended that design basis to 5.7 meters. But that actually was a voluntary extension on the part of TEPCO. That was not part of the plant's licensing documents. We also note in passing that there appears to be kind of systemic issues at play because the seismic design basis was exceeded of 3 of the units at Fukushima. So very briefly, and without trying to bore you with huge quantities of technical detail, we see 3 basic problems in Japan's approach to hazard prediction. They are first, a lack of attention to historical events. Secondly, deficiencies in the procedures used to model tsunamis. And thirdly, inattention by the regulator, the Nuclear Industrial Safety Agency, NISA, to the problem of tsunami safety generally. So the first point is lack of attention to historical information. Both international best practice as promulgated by the International Atomic Energy Agency, as well as best practice in multiple states, emphasizes the importance of looking for historical and prehistorical data, so back beyond the written records, for evidence of particularly earthquakes. And since around about the early 2000s, there's been growing evidence that the region around the plant was inundated by a large tsunami about once every 1,000 years. The most recent of those earthquakes and tsunamis was in the year 869, and there's actually documentary evidence of that within Japan. Both TEPCO and NISA, TEPCO the operator, NISA the regulator, were aware of this evidence, but it was not really followed up with sufficient alacrity. There is some evidence that some follow-up was going on, but given it was directly relevant and salient to the plant, the follow-up was not done with nearly enough alacrity. The second issue we flag up is problems with the process of tsunami modeling. Now, some of these problems were related to the lack of attention to historical detail that I've already talked about. For instance, a 2008 study that's been a bit reported in the media by TEPCO predicted that a tsunami of height 9 meters could hit the plant. And one of the things that we did was try to find out why this study was different from previous studies. And it turns out that the only difference between this study and previous studies was it assumed a repeat of the 869 earthquake, which was a bigger initiating event than the previous computer models had assumed. Unfortunately, that study wasn't followed up, and it was only actually reported to NISA, the regulator, 4 days before the accident on the 7th of March, 2011. And then there were other problems with the modeling procedure that were independent of the lack of attention paid to historical evidence. To give you one example, when the IEA mission visited Fukushima in late May and early June, they asked the plant operators, they said, okay, imagine a tsunami hits the plant. The plant's built on a slope, so there's a possibility that the tsunami will run up the slope to a higher height. What's your calculation of the run-up of the tsunami? And the details that TEPCO presented to the IEA did not consider, quote, specific and detailed arrangements of plant layout, which is not only inconsistent with international standards, that's actually inconsistent with Japan's own standards that actually required those issues specifically to be taken into account. And as we say in the paper, there's evidence that the run-up, not just the height of the tsunami, but how far the tsunami would actually run up the slope, that had been underestimated because of these problems with computer modeling. The third issue that I want to flag up is the relative inattention of NISA, the regulator, the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, the relative inattention that it paid to tsunami issues. This was a regulator that was actually pretty attentive to seismic issues, and Mark might flag up this inconsistency between its approach to seismic and its approach to tsunami safeties. But I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks that TEPCO voluntarily extended the design basis from 3.1 to 5.7 meters. This was something that was not reviewed by NISA, the regulator, when it absolutely needed to be. Similarly, in spite of the historical legacy of tsunamis that affect Japan, tsunamis are not mentioned explicitly in Japanese safety guides until as late as 2006. And even that reference is not a terribly detailed reference. This has been kind of very much picking examples of these three problems. We lay them out in considerably more depth in the paper. But our conclusion to this part is that had Japan followed international best practices and international standards, then we believe that the possibility of a tsunami might have been predicted. A massive tsunami might have been predicted. And we say might rather than would because we recognize that hazard prediction is a very considerable challenge. And it's important not to overstate your confidence in being able to predict external hazards. And so this raises the question of plant design features and whether or not there are plant design features that would have allowed the plant to survive the tsunami even if it hadn't been predicted. And that's the issue that Mark is going to look at.
Thanks, James. Good morning. I'll just continue following James's expose of the issues concerning the predictability and modeling of the tsunami itself. Back shortly after the accident, maybe about 2 months after the accident took place, I was in Vienna and I had a conversation with Akira Omoto, who some of you may know, who is a commissioner in the Atomic Energy Commission of Japan, and we were sitting in a taxi on the way to the airport together, and he said, Mark, it occurred to me while I was here in Vienna talking to people at the IEA that what we might want to think about doing, or you might even think about doing, is conducting a Gedanken experiment or a thought experiment to think about what could have saved the plant. What could Japan have done to have prevented this accident to have taken place? And that's basically what we did in this paper that James and I produced. We divided it up into two parts, and the second part of it, which I'm just going to very briefly go through, is to ask the question that if it had been the case that the Japanese, as James has outlined, could have assessed that the plant would have been vulnerable to a massive tsunami, what could they have done about it? And I asked those questions to people in Japan. I asked those questions to people outside of Japan in industry and the safety community. And I came up with a number of very consistent answers over a period of several months in various parts of the world. And the measures that we focused on in the paper are that they could have done a number of things in the design to modify the design during the course of the operating history of the plant. They could have taken the emergency diesel generators and other emergency power equipment and moved it out of the turbine building in the basement of the building where the equipment had been installed to higher ground to resist a tsunami. Now, the equipment was put into the basement of those buildings for a reason, because they were concerned about earthquake safety, and they wanted to make sure that an earthquake would not damage the equipment. But they ignored the possibility that they could have come up with a solution which would have satisfied the safety requirements to protect against both external events. Separately, they could have established watertight connections between emergency power equipment on the site and the plant itself, which would have allowed them to quickly, or more quickly, get emergency power into the plant. That was a big problem that they had when they were managing the accident in March. They could have built seawalls and dikes around the facility. That would have been a major protection measure that they could have done. And they could have also taken the equipment that they would have needed for emergency cooling and emergency power supply and actually installed that in bunkered areas or compartments of the plant that would have been protected from flooding. Finally, the measure that was most often mentioned was that the seawater pumps that were essential to conduct the decay heat away from the reactors after a shutdown, and which would also have been necessary to provide coolant for the electro generator motors. This equipment likewise could have been bunkered. It could have been placed elsewhere in the plant to protect it from a tsunami and an earthquake. In Japan, what we found out was that, in fact, there were a couple of cases where Japanese reactor owners knew this, and they took steps to protect their installations. There's a reactor in Japan, Tokai 2. This reactor, owned by the Japan Atomic Power Corp, was in the middle of undergoing some substantial design upgrades when the tsunami happened. And what happened was they had made a decision at the plant management level to erect a wall to prevent some pits from being flooded where emergency diesel generator equipment was located. They were partially successful in doing that by the time the tsunami hit. And the fact that they were able to waterproof one of two of the pits where the equipment was located saved two of the emergency diesel generators on that plant site. And when the tsunami hit, that backfit, that design upgrade that was carried out just in nick of time, probably prevented a more serious accident at that reactor as well. That that plant could have been affected with the same knockout blow as the station at Fukushima. But the backfit saved the reactor. A flood event that took place that basically represented a systematic failure in France's assessment of flood hazard at all of the plants in France, 58 reactors. What the French did was nothing less than to reassess the entire plant defense against flooding events such as that. And they went through, in a very systematic way over a period of 7 to 10 years, a project to upgrade the safety of the facility against flooding events, which cost about $150 to $200 million, which was spent on those investments. So these are the areas that significant improvements were made. I want to point out that in the case of the Blaye flood, several plants worldwide were then reassessed on the basis of a plant safety reviews, which are undertaken in many countries, including in Japan, on 10-year intervals to assess the safety, overall safety of the facility. And in the case of several of these countries, they did a PSR for the reactors in the stations after the Blaye event, and they upgraded the safety as a result. So, we basically considered that these are areas that had the regulator, together with the plant owner, had addressed at Fukushima, they would have been able to withstand a severe event such as they experienced in 2011. Having made that determination, we looked further in the paper, somewhat more speculatively, of course, to ask the question why these practices and actions were not carried out at Fukushima Daiichi. We didn't come up with any hard and fast conclusions. We were aware after a number of interviews that we carried out that, in fact, in Japan itself, there is no hard consensus about what the factors are that led Japanese authorities to make the decisions they took. But we did look into the history of the nuclear program, and we found some evidence suggesting that there were some underlying root causes that I will just briefly list. At a uranium fabrication processing plant, fuel fabrication and uranium processing plant at Tokai, in 1999 in Japan, there was a criticality accident. We saw some reports about this event, and we looked at the results. They concluded that the Tokai event represented a lack of oversight by NISA on the plant, and there were things that they should have done that they didn't do, and in particular, what the reports found out was that both the plant management and the regulator, before the criticality accident had happened, had concluded that a criticality accident at that facility was not possible. So they had basically dismissed the possibility that a serious event like that could have taken place. And if you look at the response to the safety threats facing Fukushima, you see a very similar response where the threat of an external event was not taken seriously by many decision makers in Japan before the accident. Why wasn't that the case? We looked at that a little more deeply and found that, in fact, Japan did, in one very critical area, the area of earthquakes, focus on the threat to their installations from the beginning. And if you know anything about Japan, you know that this is an industrial culture which is profoundly informed by seismic risk. The nuclear plants are not the only installations in Japan that are protected against these events. The entire fabric of regulations regarding building codes and construction for Japanese facilities is riddled with deep, detailed instructions about how to defend an installation against a seismic event. But they basically almost ignored the tsunami threat. There was very little attention to Japan to tsunami threats, and there may be reasons why we in the paper we suggest a few, but the tsunami threat was not considered as a serious threat by and large. One of the factors in this may have been the case that in Japan there is a reluctance to rely on probabilistic methods for assessing hazard, which are common in the nuclear industry worldwide and are used both for earthquakes and for tsunamis and other external events. In Japan, that wasn't the case. The Japanese were far more comfortable in making a deterministic assessment about the threats they faced. One of the things we found out was that compared to other cultures in evaluation of risk, it would appear that ultimately many people in Japan in a decision-making situation basically discounted the possibility that Japan would experience a severe accident. The regulations for handling a station blackout, if you look in the Japanese regulations from 1990, which have been maintained until now, they talk about the requirement that the nuclear reactor facilities should be designed such that a safe shutdown and proper cooling can be assured in the case of a short-term loss of power. When we asked in Japanese industry circles and regulatory circles what a short-term loss of power was, we were told that meant basically 30 minutes or less. And that's quite astounding if you look at what other countries have done in this area over the last 20 years. Basically, we were told that the people who were in charge of the Japanese nuclear program were highly confident that largely because of the robustness of the Japanese power grid and its capabilities, that they were confident that after a half an hour they'd be back up on the grid, no matter what kind of event they happened. And that was the ultimate sin in this case. They basically didn't believe that they would have a serious accident because they believed that they wouldn't lose any power. There's another series of things that we talk about as possibilities. We talk about corporate culture issues at TEPCO and other places. We talk about the fact that in one particular instance of a nuclear reactor company, Tohoku Electric Power Company, which built a 3-reactor station at a place called Onagawa, which was likewise hit by the tsunami in March, that before they built the plant, they had an interaction with local engineering personnel on the site. And there were people on the site who knew the site well, they had local knowledge, and they basically told corporate headquarters, we cannot build this nuclear installation on the seacoast. We have to move it back, and we have to build it higher up because we've had tsunamis here, they are an issue, and if we do it, we're heading for trouble. The corporate management at Tohoku heeded that advice, and in fact, before the plant was built, the siting of the plant was shifted. They spent a lot of money on this. They moved the plant back at a higher ground. They built the plant at that elevation and that location. And when the tsunami hit, the plant was, in fact, very well protected against the tsunami. It didn't damage the plant, and the plant survived. So, these are all things that we can discuss, and we'll be more than willing to heed questions about this. I'll close it here. Basically, what we concluded in the report is that in any consideration of defense against external events like this, that the design of the facility is extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Let's turn immediately to questions and discussions. Please raise your hand. We have colleagues on the sides with microphones. And then when I call you, please say who you are and where you're from. Right across from you, Zoe, the gentleman on the edge. Yeah, thanks.
One of us answers his question. Let's not both answer.
Thank you. Stephen Dolly with Platts. And thank you both for a very informative and interesting report. I guess for both of you, have you conveyed your report to TEPCO and to the Japanese regulators? If so, what kind of response are you getting? What are your plans for follow-up on making your findings available to those who are in a position to do something about them?
We, that's obviously an intrinsic part of the think tank job. Both Mark and I have good contacts with Japanese industry and regulators and authorities, and the paper wasn't completed long ago. Every day there's new information to incorporate, so the paper wasn't completed long ago. But we're just starting the process of interacting with them, and we will be, we plan to interact with lots of the relevant actors in Japan. We haven't started that process in earnest yet, but we certainly will do. The report was released today. Nobody has yet seen this.
Marco, and then the two gentlemen here. Yeah.
Marco Di Capo, NSA.
Wait for the mic, Marco.
Marco Di Capo, NSA. How challenging was actually to get access to the documentation from TEPCO and from the regulators, and what kind of linguistic support did you need to carry out this work?
Okay. Well, as I briefly stated, we relied very largely on information that we had in interviews with people who were in the Japanese industry, at TEPCO, at NISA. A lot of the information we found, in fact, was publicly available. We did not have to rely on any information which was proprietary or had not been released over the period since the exit.
What about the language?
There's one thing I would say is TEPCO, NISA have released a vast quantity of information, not all of which has been translated into English. So it's a kind of favors system. We know the people in Japan who have read it point us to the right part of the Japanese report and say, this is the part that answers the particular question that you're looking for. And then when you've isolated it to a paragraph or two, or maybe a little bit longer, you can then get those particular bits translated. But we didn't do mass translations. We got very targeted translations of what we were told by Japanese sources were key parts.
Let's take two, because this gentleman here with the yellow shirt, and then Zoe, this gentleman here on the end, and let's take both of those, and then you guys respond.
James Sang, you mentioned that IAEA has an estimate for failures using best practice. Have they ever tried sampling actual practices to obtain a failure rate?
Hold on. Thank you. I just wanted. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, notwithstanding the fact that you...
Could you please...
Sorry, Pete Baer with Climate Wire. Notwithstanding the point you make about the differences in how Japan followed international best practices, can you draw any conclusions about what lessons there are to be learned from the Fukushima accident for U.S. reactors and U.S. regulation?
On that second question, that's what the whole of the third panel is going to be about. So I promise you we're going to hit that issue today. Mark, do you want to say something very briefly about that?
Very briefly, yes. In the looking for best practices that Japan could have followed, we were struck how significantly the European nuclear programs had, since the Fukushima accident, showed in a very transparent manner activities that had been undergone in European nuclear programs over a period of 20 years to upgrade the design basis of the facilities themselves. And I haven't seen anything like that so far in the United States. Perhaps that's something which is still in process. But the European regulators that we talked to seem to make a distinction between the European approach, which is much more reliant on hardware changes in facilities to accommodate changes in threat assessment. And what they broadly suggested was a U.S. approach which is informed by cost-benefit analyses to a much greater extent, which is informed by a backfit rule, which is a different approach completely. So, the Europeans sometimes say, in their view, it looks as if their approach to safety is to enhance the safety of facility, and the U.S. approach, in their view, is to maintain a certain level of safety. That's a great oversimplification, but we heard that on several occasions.
How about this first question?
I haven't seen anything credible that does that. I've seen studies that purport to compare the theoretical results of safety analyses to the actual results, but nothing that I would regard as credible. Now, that's not to say the credible study is not out there. That's to say that I haven't found it. But part of the difficulty is, as I understand it, if I understand this correctly, the IEA 1 to 7 safety scale, incidents are only made public if the country chooses to make them public. So to my knowledge, there's no comprehensive database out there of worldwide reactor incidents and accidents, which makes that kind of comparison very hard.
Is there any database of worldwide practices? I mean, this is the IAEA study based on best practices. Do we know what actual practices are? I'm talking about basically how well we understand the IAEA system for evaluating safety, i.e. how good are their parameters?
Oh, well, all right. The areas we're talking about here, heat sink, station blackout, flooding, are three separate areas that are covered by different programs at the IEA. They don't overlap, and there's no common baseline that they use to establish a record like that. But as I suggested, there are areas in the paper, there are areas where the IEA has been more forward-looking and more proactive in this area, and there are other areas where they've been less. The same goes for national authorities, where in the area of heat sink, there's been comparatively little attempt to unify a safety culture or safety regime worldwide to handle that problem, while in the area of station blackout, there's been more coordinated attention to it.
Let's take Christopher, and then if there's... Go ahead and let's see. Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Christopher Payne with NRDC. Following the accident, Secretary General or IEA Director Amano sought to establish a binding international evaluation process for reactor safety, and the United States led the charge against that. And I just wondered if you understood the rationale for the U.S. position, and was that a good move on the part of the United States?
The United States was by no means alone in leading that charge. It would appear that very powerful countries with major nuclear programs worldwide shared the view of the U.S. that decisions on nuclear safety regulation were sovereign decisions that were made by individual countries, and they did not want to see a multilateral body intervene in a decision which ultimately they believed was a decision of national security.
I actually have to say, on a more kind of philosophical note, I genuinely worry about the moral hazard associated with some form of international binding regulation. I want countries who operate nuclear power to feel completely responsible for their power plants. I don't want them to feel that there's a higher authority to which they can defer authority for regulation, because I think if you go down that route, you risk encouraging sloppy regulation and sloppy enforcement of regulation, because countries think, well, ultimately we're not responsible at some level for the safety of our own power plants. So, it's a bit like the way that once you've bought ski insurance, you ski more aggressively. It's that kind of moral hazard impact. So I personally am slightly wary about internationalizing regulation. Cooperation is a different story, but I am slightly wary about internationalizing regulation.
Chris, follow with the microphone.
Just on that point, I think Amano's proposal was that there be binding international standards, not that there be some sort of international enforcement regime, and that the authority would remain to enforce those standards would remain with national authorities, but that everybody would be brought to the same level, and we would have perhaps avoided the problems that we're going to see in the future of seriously substandard safety as we saw in Japan.
Right, but I think the problem still exists. If the standards are set internationally, then countries go, we don't need to worry about creating appropriate high-quality local standards. We can just import the IAEA standards straight in. So I think the moral hazard problem still applies.
Gentleman behind there.
Steve Winters, local researcher. I've been trying to follow this for about a year now with everything I could find on the net. And actually, I live down the block from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, for what that's worth. But there seemed to be a great problem over this year of finding out exactly what happened in the course of the accident. A lot of information, even the Japanese admit, was not, they withheld and so forth and so on. It's not even clear now whether there were criticalities, whether fuel rods were blown away, whether it was just a hydrogen explosion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Could you comment on best practices in terms of giving information to the public or not to the public about what's actually going on so that people can make their informed decisions? I mean, because you mentioned you had so much data that you looked at, but other people comment, well, I've got all this data, but I don't have the data I need.
Hold that thought. Pierce.
Pierce Gordon with the American Association for Advancement of Science. For Mark, you mentioned that the Japan approach
Speak
to...
up a little bit, Pierce.
You mentioned that the Japan's approach to dealing with the risks of tsunami was not probabilistically based, but they do deal with seismic hazards. Could you expand a little bit on what the differences are and why, in fact, they shouldn't be doing both the same way, and why ultimately they both don't involve probabilistic assessments of risk?
Okay, so information probabilities.
Do you want me to?
Well, I think we can both actually weigh in on this. The one thing I want to point out to the gentleman there on my left is that we did not get in this paper to the issues of managing the accident, which would have to rely on the kind of information you're talking about. We looked at other aspects of the problem, namely, following up what Emoto-san had suggested, what could have been done to have prevented the accident from happening, and which actually relied on far less information about the accident sequence itself than you're suggesting. The other problem that you're pointing to is the problem or the question about how could Japan have managed the accident in a way to have prevented meltdowns, assuming that they had the design basis they had. And we didn't go there for this paper. That's a separate topic, and we may not be able to answer those questions for many, many years, certainly not until we drill into the reactor and find out what is actually inside the facility.
Let me add a couple of points about the information. I think Japanese authorities themselves have acknowledged that in the hours and days immediately after the accident, the flow of information was not great at times. Then again, disasters are unbelievably difficult to handle. I mean, when you have hundreds of thousands of people being evacuated, and you're trying to coordinate a triple disaster. This wasn't just the nuclear disaster. There was the earthquake. There was the tsunami. You had kind of 25,000 people dead in total due to the tsunami. Like the latest figure I've seen, which I believe includes people who chose to evacuate themselves, but the latest government figure is over 300,000 evacuees from the plant. So, A, the information challenge is enormous. B, there's a lot out there, especially in the months and now the year after the accident. A lot of it is pretty hard to digest technical stuff. A lot of it hasn't yet been translated, but I have to say I acknowledge that translating technical reports into English is probably not the Japanese government's key priority right now, and not unreasonably so. Some of the information that people want is simply not known. I mean, you can't send guys in to inspect the condition of the fuel, so some of the relevant information is not known. Obviously, one of the critical issues that the government report and the independent report need to get into is whether information was deliberately withheld or wrong information was deliberately put out. That is a point that I think needs to be fully investigated, and I have seen no evidence yet to suggest there was deliberately wrong information put forward or relevant information deliberately held, notwithstanding the nightmare of information delivery in that kind of crazy context after the accident.
I like that distinction. Do you want to take
Yeah.
Pierce's question,
Pierce,
and then we're going to have to wrap up. Yeah.
Okay, Pierce, I think the simple answer is that it is a mystery. If you were in Japan and you go to Japan, you experience earthquakes every day. You're in bed and the thing vibrates. You walk around the street and...
But that's from putting a quarter in.
Maybe. Okay. But, you don't have a tsunami every day. I mean, a tsunami comes to a location once every, 1,000 years. It doesn't happen very often. Maybe you get some tsunami information, but the Japanese are uniquely focused on this earthquake issue. The tsunami is something which really is out of sight and out of mind for many people in Japan. It just is not focused on. We don't really know the reason.
I mean, I'd add, I think it was, I'd have to check up the dates in the report. I think it was 2002 was the first official methodology endorsed by NISA, the regulator, and developed by the Japan Society for Civil Engineers to evaluate tsunami safety. And that was a so-called deterministic model. So it's essentially, and this is a slight simplification, but it worked out the maximum level of the tsunami, and that was it. They were in the process of developing a probabilistic model. That is being worked on, to my knowledge, at the current time. But the whole process was massively delayed relative to the state of seismic safety, which goes back to the issue that Mark made, that much, much higher priority was given to seismic rather than tsunami safety. At least in the case of the regulator, that was partly a funding decision. There was much more money channeled to seismic safety than tsunami safety. And there's other possibilities that we explore in the paper, but I think I'll just leave that there.
Okay, great. Let me thank Mark and James. Don't applaud yet. I want to thank you, and I want to say that we have our keynote speaker, Commissioner Apostolakis, here, and we're going to go right into that session. So stay seated, unless, of course, you have to visit facilities, but it's not a break. And we're going to move right in that transition. But now I want to thank Mark and James for a really excellent presentation.